light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Even more so today, welcome to the episode number 300 of Sister Who Presents. The show from the beginning has always been about a person is a person is a person is a person, and mutual respect is really where all the relationships have to start. In all of that, I see myself as the servant of the work, not the one who controls it. I don't dress up. I have never dressed up to simply draw attention to myself, but always to use symbol and metaphor as a way of serving the personal and spiritual growth of others. And what has been amazing to me that I noticed fairly early on was the way that when I put on the costume, the most amazing synchronicities would start happening. Connections that I could never have taken credit for, really. Things that happen, people are in particular places. One of the friends who was very supportive of me in the beginning was my friend Dan, who has long since passed away from AIDS-related complications. And because Sister Who was so much a part of our friendship, I chose to attend his memorial service in costume as Sister Who. And I got there early and didn't know what else to do, so I went down and sat at the piano and began playing some of the hymns I knew, just from memory on the piano. And as I was playing the melody for the hymn Sweet Hour of Prayer, Dan Cardoca's parents entered the back of the sanctuary, and they were both Foursquare gospel ministers, and I was later told that they were nervous about coming to a gay church, even though it was for a memorial service for their son, because they were both Foursquare gospel Protestant ministers. And when they stepped in the room and heard Sweet Hour Prayer playing and seeing Sister Who at the piano, somehow it just told them everything was going to be okay. And I was honored that God could use me in that way to bring comfort to this mother at this memorial service for her son, who had been such a marvelous friend of mine. Another person who was a very significant friend of mine over the years, I first met as Mark Woods, a very creative and unique person, an amazingly insightful and wise person, I thought. But over time, also someone who came to the conclusion or made the discovery of being transgender. And so I had one early episode where I interviewed Mark Woods, the very spiritual atheist, because he was very concerned about spirituality. He just didn't relate to the divine in the usual way. His upbringing in the Jehovah's Witnesses church didn't serve him particularly well, as he was finding himself anomalous. At first thinking he was a gay man, but not really sure about that, and then finding he was a transgender woman. And so later I interviewed him again on the show as Miss Marky Woods, finding herself, learning all sorts of things about herself, getting a fresh glimpse of who she was and what everything meant. And I was trying to relate to what it would be like to be a soul caught in the middle of this gender question. And so, inspired by Miss Marky, I wrote the song My Soul Knows Its Face. The first verse simply says, "For so very long I remember my reflection wasn't me, but a different form and a different norm, something I was supposed to be. I remember touching others with hands that weren't my own. I remember being something that's no longer so unknown." And then the chorus says, "Now my soul knows its face, and my heart finally knows its place. There's still a chance that my feet will dance and my voice will sing out my true name. The music of my heart and hands, a holy mystery forever stands. For love unknown within has grown to become the gift of me." And then as I got into the second verse, it says, "I remember being hungry for love without demands. I remember being lonely in a world of shifting sands. I remember too the moment when the sun began to rise I remember the revelation and tears of joy within my eyes. And the first time I sang this for her, of course, saying, "This is the song you inspired," she about had tears running down her face too. But I wanted to capture the wonder of finally finding herself after that many years of searching and the struggle that life was. Unfortunately, the ending of the story is a little bit sad in that it was several years later, that 5 or 6 years later, when Miss Markey completed her transition and became Lillian Grace Marlowe, and having completed her transition, suddenly found herself as a 52-year-old unemployed transgender woman, unable to find a place for herself in the world, and wound up committing suicide. And it was the maintenance man and I who found the body. And it was such a tragedy because she was such a gifted artist and such a loss. But I was honored to be able to facilitate the memorial service as Sister Who and to play a recording of her singing the song "My Soul Knows Its Face" within that memorial service. In doing this show in the first place, it's always been very common sense discussion of issues of life and spirituality, and yet because we're dealing with symbols and metaphors, the appearance is always very theatrical. One person said when they went to their television, they would turn the sound off and it looked like one show, and then they would turn the bright knob on their old television so that the picture would go away and they just listened to it. And it was like two different shows, because as far as the audio, it was common sense discussion of issues of life and spirituality. But as far as the video, it was very theatrical, symbolic, metaphorical sorts of appearances. And because it was this totally uncategorizable work, I offered it to a local public broadcasting station once, hoping to get my show in front of a larger audience. And they kind of watched it and scratched their head and looked at me and said, "We don't know what to put it between." And so I always described it as the funniest rejection I ever got. But the work remains very uncategorizable. And for some people that's challenging. For a lot of people that provides a reason to think and grow in new directions. Over time now, jumping around here a bit, but because the show now goes out also over the internet through a YouTube channel as well as on local public access television, it is being picked up and watched all over the world, basically. Out of the blue once, not a couple years ago, 2-3 years ago, I received an email from someone in Massachusetts. This man, Brian, described his friend Erin, who had just come out as a lesbian and was going through some really difficult times and some struggles, and he asked her what she wanted for her birthday, and she said, "To get my smile back." Well, he knew at that point, he says he knew at that point what to do, because she had visited someone in California, in San Francisco, and had heard of Sister Who, and so had been watching over the internet. And so she said for her birthday she wanted to get her smile back. And he, with his artistry, managed to concoct a birthday cake shaped and decorated to look like Sister Who. And so he was sending me this email with a photograph of her birthday party. And it's him and Erin and the birthday cake of Sister Who. And she has got the most beautiful smile all across her face. And I was, he said, "There's a bunch of us in Massachusetts who are watching you." I had no idea, but it was such an honor and so wonderful to know that a good effect was happening, even without me having the idea. Another time I was lining up for a pride parade once, and somebody came up and said, "I was going through a really dark time last winter, and I caught your show on television, and I just want to thank you because you totally inspired me, and I'm here today because of you." And I was just, "Thank you, I'm glad I could help." I just felt so humbled by how honorable it is, how wonderful it is to have a positive effect on someone's life that way. But what made it a bit interesting was that I still don't know what show he was watching, because at that particular time we weren't in active production, and it was a show that was in reruns. Another time you never know where Sister Who will show up next, I guess. I also, among other things, create an inspirational calendar each year. And so we go all over the place taking photos of Sister Who doing different things, trying to come up with an image and a caption in each case that you can ponder for a whole month and still get something out of it. Once we were doing a photo shoot up at a ski area in central Colorado, and I was walking across a plaza on my way just to let the administrators know I was there, and we were going to go do the pictures now. And suddenly a woman off to the right said, "Oh my God, it's you." And I was like, "Huh? What? Can I have a hug?" Well, of course. And it was wonderful to have that kind of validation, because so much of the time I have no idea if anybody's watching at all. I do these shows we record these for a camera, and there isn't any response, and I don't know. But then suddenly I meet someone or I go someplace. It's actually been over 15 years since I could go anywhere in public in costume without someone saying, "I've been watching you on television." I had one young lady come up to me just a few years ago and remark, "I've been watching you on television all my life." And I thought, considering that the first show Cablecast in 1992, that's entirely possible, because she looked to be about 17 or 18 or so. I have no idea who's watching, but it underscores to me just how much this really is a ministry. It really is a spiritual calling when I hear about these sorts of juxtapositions or connections later. Some of them are even more remarkable, however. Because I enjoy hiking mountains, I've gotten into climbing 14ers, mountains that reach higher than 14,000 feet, in full costume as Sister Who. And I've actually done 15 14ers so far. And most of them, there are remarkable stories of who I meet along the trail. When I was going up Quandary Peak, a woman came down the trail and asked, "Aren't you the one I saw on television?" And I said, "Why, yes. How did you find me?" Because, of course, we're 150 miles out in the wilderness. And yet here we are halfway up the side of Quandary Peak and having this meeting. When I was hiking up Mount Bierstadt, I met a young lady who at that moment was contemplating whether or not to become a Roman Catholic nun. And so as she's wrestling with this difficult decision, she gets to have a conversation with none other than Sister Who, a gay man in a nun's habit or a nun's costume, climbing a mountain, and we had a very deep intellectual conversation about the place of religious vocation in contemporary life, and what it really means to be a nun, that it's not really about gender or religion. I mean, there are nuns of various religions, not just Roman Catholic ones, but in every case, it's about spiritual service, a dedication to spiritual service. And that has always been at the heart of what Sister Who does. It's not about me, it's about being the servant of the work. I hiked Mount Sherman in, I think it was 2009, if I remember correctly, with a friend, and we got to the summit of Mount Sherman because we were both locals and in pretty good shape, used to the altitude. And then this gentleman approached right behind us and asked, "Okay, now that you've had your fun, could you move away so we could have the mountaintop?" And I kind of thought that was very odd, and I said, "Well, there's plenty of room, come on up." Well, they wanted to have their own little gathering of sorts, and come to find out that it was a group of perhaps a dozen young boys from some conservative Christian church in Kansas, I think. And the leadership was concerned that Sister Who might somehow be dangerous. I don't know, make them think unusual things or contemplate whether gay people are part of God's plan. I don't know. They wanted to protect their boys from Sister Who, and so they didn't want the two of us in too close a proximity. Okay, fine. I was respectful. I didn't want to make a scene or anything. That was their choice and, their leadership choice. So So we moved off to the side. They came up and looked around the summit and then disappeared. I think they must have ran all the way down because we didn't see them the whole way back. The amazing thing is 2 years later, 2011, I've been watching all summer long for a window of 3 good days to hike Mount Antero. And finally, the weather forecast says, okay, 3 days of sun. So I head up there. I get to the trailhead the night before. It's a very difficult, rough trailhead to get to. I do makeup in the car by flashlight. I start the hike at dawn, just as it's barely light enough to even see the trail. I got all the way to the summit. That was wonderful. I played my bagpipe for a couple minutes, took some pictures using the self-timer on my camera, had a snack, and got ready to go. Guess who comes onto the summit of Mount Antero? It was the same group of boys from Mount Sherman 2 years before. But here we are 2 years later meeting on the summit of Mount Antero when all these variables, and I was only up there 20 minutes, and I mean that kind of synchronicity. You know, I was able to have a few basic discussions with them, respond to a few questions about inclusive spirituality and so forth. And as I was leaving, I said, you know, God meant this to happen. There's no way on earth that all of us could wind up meeting again on the only mountain summit I hiked that summer with only a 20-minute window of intersection. You know, that we would both be there at the same time. It's just amazing. You know, times where you're in perhaps a lighthearted sense, we say there has to be a God. That couldn't have happened any other way. In doing this show, I've gotten to meet a lot of really fascinating, wonderful people. Among them was a wonderful man named Joe Bell, who was doing a hike across the country in honor of his gay son who had committed suicide after being bullied for being gay. And Joe is the father I think every gay man wishes he would have had. An incredible man, and yet a very ordinary man, not necessarily eloquent or anything, but someone of such honesty and integrity that he spoke, you know, every time he shared his story, it was so powerful. And it was such an honor to meet him and to speak with him at length. And, you know, the tragedy in his case was, I guess tragedy from our perspective, was that as he was continuing his walk, he was hit by a semi-truck and killed. So in the spiritual sense, yes, he and Jaden got to be together again. I know the separation was very difficult for him because he talked about it in that way. But I'm so blessed to have been able to talk to him closely for at least the time that I did, to learn from him whatever I could. You know, and hopefully from the part of the walk that he did do, many other people were inspired to move toward constructive change in our world as well, which is an ongoing theme of Sister Who Presents, that it's about understanding those who are different from ourselves and having that civil dialogue. You know, when I had a guest on the show who has been blind since birth, and we're talking about people with disabilities, and she said, the thing you have to remember about the category of people with disabilities is that everybody is a candidate. It could happen to any one of us at any point in time. But in many cases, at least for her especially, because of her having been born blind, that it wasn't a question of being broken as much as it was a question of relating to the world in a very different way. The subject even came up of, you know, what about someone being healed and no longer being blind? And it would raise the issue of having to learn to read and write all over again, because the blind person has learned to relate to the world in a particular way. And, you know, does that mean that if they were healed and suddenly they could see, that they would have to wear a blindfold and still read books in Braille in order to read, or would they have to go back to kindergarten and learn how to read and write all over again in order to re-emerge in life as a seeing person? It's not about being a broken person. It's about learning a particular way of relating to the world. As Sister Who, I don't really see myself as cross-dressing, because to me, Sisterhood is a deeper level of personhood that precedes questions of gender and orientation. The idea is that you have to be a who before you can be a he or she, and you have to be a he or she before you can be gay or straight. As you know, in becoming more aware of our own personhood, which is definitely what this ongoing television series Sisterhood Presents aspires to do, to understand first what it is, to become more aware of what it is, to be a unique point of consciousness, to realize that you see the world in a way that nobody else will ever see the world, that your perspective, your experience, your way of processing, your way of understanding is totally unique. In all the billions of people, you are totally unique, and your perspective could be a treasure, could be exactly what people need in order to understand their own lives better, even with all the differences between their lives and yours. And coming to a place of understanding yourself as a unique perspective, a unique experience, a unique consciousness, to then understand that that particular consciousness gets to express itself through a particular gender, through a particular culture, through a particular language, and the ways that each of those layers of personhood begin to shape and alter, hopefully in constructive ways, the way that you present yourself to the world. To say, sister, who does she think she is? Who is it that we think we are? How does that change throughout life? How does our understanding of ourselves affect the way we present ourselves? That if the same consciousness were in a different body, we're in a different culture, we're in a different situation, it would express itself differently. Which kind of leads to the phrase of, there but for the grace of God go I. That except for the accident of birth, we might be in anyone else's shoes. All the more reason to find a way to love them. It's about letting the wisdom of each of us become the wisdom of all of us, and letting God, that which is truly God, manifest God's self to each person in whatever way God chooses. I have no interest in ever placing God in a box limited by human doctrine or dogma. To consider something capable of supreme, of highest wisdom and greatest love, it seems laughable and totally ridiculous to think of that sort of capacity being describable by human language, being able to be encompassed or limited or fully described by human theology. God is the ocean and I'm a single glass of water, and we're simply trying to have a relationship of love. And I find it fascinating all the different ways that ocean relates to all the different glasses of water that each of us are, each of us looking from our own limited perspective. And it really comes down to the wisdom of each of us becoming the wisdom of all of us, and the love of any of us becoming the love of all of us, and joining together to forge a world, to create a world that has perhaps only been imagined thus far, and perhaps not even imagined. There have been different times where it became extremely difficult. One in particular was so difficult that I spent 3 weeks in prayer asking, why is it so important that I keep going? Why is it so important that I keep the website of sisterhood.com going? And why is it so important that I keep the monthly newsletter of Sisterhood's Perspective going? And what finally came through after 3 weeks of intense prayer is that the ultimate goal was to create a genuinely interfaith spiritual center that would nurture the relationship between humanity and the divine without placing any dogma or discrimination upon it to say what form it had to take, but to allow God to define God's self to each individual in whatever way God wanted to. That a spiritual center that would be like a library, available resources for people who were seeking, who were spiritually hungry, and who wanted to know God, and who, for whatever reason, found this or that example of institutionalized religion to be inadequate to what their faith, to what their spirit, to what their soul needed. And so because of that, when the opportunity presented itself, And so I wound up, because of Sister Who, going to Iliff School of Theology and accomplishing a master's degree in theological studies. And while there, at one point, I was invited to do a presentation in the weekly chapel service, and I thought was a very great honor. But it was anticipated that I would simply give a speech the way so many other presenters in chapel had done. And I just said, well, that's not really how Sister Who works. And I wound up instead creating a modern morality play featuring Sister Who as a sort of everyman character, going through this journey, dealing with relationships. The structure of the play was actually drawn from the parable of the Good Samaritan. But the final result was such a powerful integration of theater and spirituality that everyone was raving about it for 2 weeks afterwards. A professor was quoting from it in class the next day, and at the end of the year they gave me an award for having demonstrated interest and ability in innovative worship, is how they put it. Since that time I've written 2 more plays, drawing from being inspired by the parable of the talents and also the parable of the sower and the seed. And so this is a whole new direction that the ministry of Sister Who may go, in addition to everything that's been done so far. I hope that you'll continue to watch as the spiritual path continues to unfold, and I hope most of all that it is genuinely empowering to your own spiritual path, whatever description that may include.